Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, today I'm joined by Steve Mason, our managing consultant at Blackmores, who is our information security expert. And Steve, if you listened to the last episode, covered the 11 new controls. And today we're going to be dipping into just one of those controls. But over the next couple of episodes, we are going to explore a couple of these new controls because we know that businesses that are looking to integrate to the new standard and to apply the controls from ISO 27002, it's going to be really important. So, yeah, welcome back, Steve.
Nice to be back, Mel. Nice to be back.
Great. So there's one particular aspect of ISO 27002. One of the new controls is on data masking, which is A.8.11. So, Steve, I know that you've had time to explore this and delve into it in a bit more detail. And it would be brilliant if you could share some insights into data masking with us on the ISO show today. So, yeah, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your knowledge today.
It's a pleasure. If we look at the standard 27002 and we go to 8.8.11, we see data masking. One of the first things that users will see is the control, the purpose and the attributes. Now these are very, very important to get to grips with because these can actually inform how we view the control. So the whole purpose of the actual control is about masking data, but the purpose is to limit the exposure of sensitive data, including PII, to comply with legal, statutory, regulatory and contractual requirements. And this is what I love about this standard, is that we've got that purpose in there now, which is going to save so many arguments between assessors and consultants and perhaps customers, because we can all go back to that purpose. What's the purpose we set out to do? And the client can turn around and say, well, look, I know what my sensitive data is. It isn't just PII, it's financial data. It could be data to do with any sort of development they're doing. So if they're sharing anything like that and they feel there's certain things they need to mask, then they can mask that data, but they need to know how to do it.
Now, just for the benefit of our listeners that aren't familiar with what PII is, could you explain about that, please, in its context with GDPR?
Yeah, PII, it's personally identifiable information, and that's a thing that came out with GDPR, and it's all about data protection, protecting someone's data. And if we want a sort of definition of PII, it's one or more pieces of information about an individual that can identify a person. So if you take the name Steve Mason, I know there are 6 of us where I live in my town. Steve Mason on its own could be any one of us 6, but the minute you add a postcode to our names, or the minute you add an age to our names, is the minute you've begun to identify who we are. So that's 2 pieces of information needed just to identify me as an individual. So that's really what PII is about.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah, I was just going to go on to the attributes. This is the other bit I think that could so easily be overlooked if we're not careful. I've actually decided to call it attributes and sub-attributes because you have the 5 attribute categories. Then underneath those attribute categories, you've got lots of sub-attributes. In some cases, you've got 2 or 3. In others, you may have about 10 sub-attributes. And this can be quite important when we come down to auditing our systems or monitoring the effectiveness of our systems. So let's say we wanted to do an analysis on confidentiality. We could actually look at the attributes around information security properties, look up confidentiality as a sub-attribute. Where does it appear against which controls, and do an audit around those controls. And that way we're actually doing an audit around a theme. I'm hoping that with this sort of thing in mind that assessment bodies are going to sort of think outside the box and allow companies to perhaps audit as per a theme or something like that. and not expect the sort of mechanical auditing of clause by clause, control by control, because I don't think that's going to serve any purpose with the new standard. So that's a move I think we've all got to make a consideration on and make a move on.
Okay, then that's great. Lovely. Thanks very much for that, Steve. So for those listeners that aren't familiar with data masking, that they've never heard of data masking, could you describe what it actually is?
Right, there are probably three words that come up when we talk about data masking. They're all very difficult words to say, but I'll have a go. There's data, there's data obfuscation, which is
that could be a swear word, Steve.
Yeah, that's right.
You have to be careful how you say that one.
That's right. Yeah. Well, we often hear sort of parliamentarians talking about obfuscating. Well, obfuscation is making the data unclear or jumbled.
Little bit like encryption.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a kind of encryption. So, and the next one is data anonymization. So that's removal of the personally identifiable information totally and just taking it out, so that all you're left with is raw data without any link to an individual. Then finally, there's a pseudonymization, and that is actually taking out information but replacing it with false information. Okay. When I say that, it doesn't mean that you replace the information that you want to do your analysis around with false information. You just replace some of the other information that's not going to be analysed with false information. That way it can't be linked back to an individual or perhaps even a product or a company even. So those are the three words: obfuscation, anonymization and pseudonymization.
Bit of a mouthful there, Steve. Well done. Great. No, that all makes perfect sense, actually, now that you've explained it. That's great. So ultimately, it's the process of replacing that confidential data by using other fictitious data, such as characters or other data, is it?
Absolutely, because you could, in case of pseudonymization, let's say you had a person's name, you might replace it with a number. I remember when I was auditing certain companies, when I worked for BSI, I was auditing hospitals and clinics, and often there I would never use the name of a patient. I would always use a reference number which the client was happy for me to use, sort of thing. And that way we'd introduce that pseudonymization and anonymization, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really just think about what you want to use. What's the easiest thing? And plus there's lots of tools nowadays built into our systems that enable this sort of thing to happen quite easily. So I think individual organisations need to look at what they have in their toolbox and use that effectively. If not, there are plenty of tools out there they can buy to help them. And Microsoft is getting better and better each day with that sort of thing. So if you're into your Microsoft suites, then it's all out there for you.
And I think obviously since the last version of ISO 27001 was published, GDPR wasn't really a thing. Obviously different countries had their own versions of the Data Protection Act, but it makes a lot of sense to include data masking now as a new control, doesn't it? As it's such a crucial area for all organisations to make sure that they're aware of these ways of being able to reduce risk and how to apply them.
Absolutely, and this is the wonderful thing about this control is that before we only had that old control of A.18.1.4, which was privacy and protection of personally identifiable information. Well, what does that mean? I mean, anybody could choose their own things about this. This is now getting much more specific and saying, right, yeah, you've got to protect data, but you've got to consider data masking as being the control, because that's one of the best ways of making sure you protect people's information.
So obviously this is a key control for 27001, for the new version that will be coming out, and also GDPR, but no doubt it relates to other standards concerning PII.
Yes, yeah. There are a few standards now beginning to be produced, and all of them are quite useful to have. The first one is ISO 27017, 27017. And that's information security in the cloud, and it's linked to PII, personally identifiable information. And then we have the sister standard to that, which is ISO 27018 27018, which is information security in the public cloud, and again to protect PII. Now that's really for organisations that manage public clouds. So not all organisations are going to go for that standard, but they will definitely or should definitely consider the controls of 27017. Then we finally have that new standard that's come out, which is ISO 27701, and it's information security of PII cloud security. So this one actually links in nicely with GDPR, because it aligns with, perhaps even aligns with the old standard BS 10012. So there's a lot of things to be gained from this. Again, it gives you a set of controls, rather like 27001, that you need to follow to make sure that you're producing good controls around PII. So those three standards are standards that should be considered if you want to take this data masking to, let's say best practice in that sense.
Okay, so for those listeners that aren't that familiar with data masking, and if they had to make a business case, for introducing this within their organisation, regardless if they had 27001 or not, why would you say data masking is important right now?
I think it's important because if you think about the sort of breaches there are, particularly around Pci identifiable information and the increased fines that are coming out from the ICO, that's one thing to consider. So that makes it important in that sense. Moving on from sort of Pci identifiable information, there's other important strategic information in organisations, such as IPR, which is intellectual property rights, and we may also consider financial information. All of this is important to an organisation, and that needs to be protected just as much as PII. So if we allowed our financial information to escape the organisation, our competitors could use that. If we allowed our intellectual property to escape the organisation, again, competitors could use that to perhaps develop equipment that they hadn't even begun to start on. So that's why it's important. It's not just from a legal point of view, it's really from a business strategy point of view as well. Okay,
that's great. And how would you describe data masking actually working in practice?
Right. Okay. That's interesting. There's lots of different ways in which we can cover that. It depends what sort of data masking you've decided to use. So, and as I say, there's lots of tools out there that can be used, and we need to think about the different ways in which systems work as well. So there are different types of data masking. There's what's known as static data masking. So this is sometimes referred to SDM, and data is masked at the original database and then duplicated into a test environment so that the business can share test data with a third-party vendor or customer, that sort of thing. So that's a single source, and you just mask the data. Then we have what's known as dynamic data masking, which is DDM. And there's no need for a second data source to store the masked data. In this case, the original sensitive data remains the repository and is accessible to any application that uses it. So, and this is where it becomes dynamic. You've actually got it masked, but there's lots of different systems coming in and using that information. So that's what's meant by dynamic data masking. There are lots of different ways of doing that, and I appreciate there are lots of experts out there that would know how to do that really well. But it saves you, in some respects, having to keep masking data every time you use it, sort of thing. So if I was to choose a source, I would choose the dynamic data masking personally, and that way you know it's done once and it's used by lots of different systems around the company.
Thanks for explaining the static data masking and the dynamic data masking, Steve. I've also heard a rumour that there's something called on-the-fly data masking as well, which is an interesting on-the-fly. Does that mean what it actually sounds like?
Yeah, it really is, and it's often used in sort of development, that sort of thing. So we find that on-the-fly data masking is doing it as you come across it, sort of thing. So there may not be a data source that you're referring back to, but it may be that as you develop something, you just have to mask it as you go, sort of thing. So developers may be used to this sort of thing. And again, it's about protecting that sort of IPR in your business, intellectual property in the business. So
yeah, okay. So it's about being aware of these different options of types of data masking and to apply the most appropriate one then for your organisation, depending on function and the type of data. Okay.
exactly.
So it sounds like there are a number of different techniques for data masking, suitable for different things. Could you just provide an overview on this, please, Dave?
Yeah, the different techniques of data masking could include substitution. So that's where you actually, we go back to the different definitions we had earlier of anonymization, pseudonymization. And substitution is where you actually just take out information and replace it with other information. So that way it can't be linked back to an individual, a product or a business. Then there's shuffling. This is another quite common way of data masking. In the shuffling method, it's just like substitution. The business substitutes original data with other authentic looking data, but they shuffle the entities in the same column and randomly.
Okay, a bit like shuffling a pack of cards then, ultimately.
Absolutely. And it could be that, again, it goes down to that sort of encryption sort of thing. So you might take a word like grown, and you can turn the word grown into wrong or something like that, you know. So you shuffle the data to make it look different. As long as you know what your shuffling is, then you're all right. You don't want to go to a point where it makes things more confusing for you. So personally, I would go for the substitution because I think that's the easier thing to do. There are number and date variances that could be used. These are particularly useful for finance organisations, where they may sort of just change some of the data to make it more masked to people that wouldn't be used to it. It could be that the date variance might be that you've put a strange way of putting the date on, that then people can't associate it, let's say, with August 2022. And when they look at it, only the organisation will know that it refers to August 2022, but the date that's on there might suggest it comes from another point in time. So that's another way of doing it.
Okay, great. And would you say that encryption is probably still the most popular way?
Yeah, I think encryption is probably the most popular. We're all used to encryption, and we've got the encryption tools built into our systems and laptops, and probably it's the most secure way. But if you use encryption, you've got to have your decryption keys available. That then links you into one of the other controls where you need to make sure your decryption keys are managed effectively and are only used by certain people, or they're stored and kept secure by certain people. And if they're used, often they're single use, but if they're multi-use, then make sure they can't be got at by anybody just to use randomly.
Okay, great. And are there any other techniques of data masking?
There is one other that sometimes people might come across, and is character scrambling. The method involves randomly rearranging the order of characters. This process is irreversible though, so the original data cannot be obtained from the scrambled data. So you've got to be very careful how you use these things. And this is where I would say to all organisations, use a type of data masking that suits your needs. You're not trying to second guess the standard. You're not trying to second guess the assessor coming in. You're looking at your business. You're saying to yourself, what are the risks to me in this business, and what level of data masking do I need? And then you apply the most appropriate. So I think that's the real message to get from this.
Yeah, definitely. And that's all dependent on the type of data that requires that masking.
Yes.
So obviously you mentioned about PII, the personally identifiable information.
Yes, yeah.
Are there any other types of data that we should be taking into consideration when we're looking at this new control?
Very much so, yes. There's PHI, which is protected health information. This comes up quite a bit now. I've seen it. And there is another standard, which is ISO 27799, and I'm wondering whether that's going to be updated in line with the new 27002, because that's what it was supposed to be. And it does focus on health information. So it includes sort of demographic information, medical histories, test and laboratory results, mental health conditions, insurance information, and anything that would do, link to somebody's health. So that's important. Then we all come across the famous Pci Dss, which is all about payment card industry security. That's most important. Anybody doing any sort of payment card transactions in their organisation need to consider what level of Pci Dss they're at. And that's all important in protecting your data. And you could so easily get a non-conformity around data masking if you haven't or can't demonstrate that you've got some sort of registration around Pci Dss. And if you haven't got a registration around it, you've got to be able to demonstrate why you haven't got a registration. All of that, I would urge people, I'm not an expert on Pci Dss, but I would just say to people, go to the website for Pci Dss and look at the guidelines on there and understand whether you need to be registered and to what level you need to be registered. And that's the important thing to do there. We mentioned earlier intellectual property. So important. Lots of companies are coming up with new ideas, new creations, ways of working. So think about your intellectual property, and that even includes your company name and your branding. That is intellectual property. How often do we find companies' branding and their name being misrepresented or misused in some way? What I would be picking up here in an audit is if I was auditing company A and somehow they were using company B's branding, perhaps to do a report to company B, I would be asking the question, okay, what authority do you have to use that branding, and how do you know it's the latest branding? So that's where you can sort of get caught out there. That's not necessarily data masking, but that's about intellectual property. So those are the different types of data that could be used. And then the rest is just anything that's strictly confidential within an organisation. We said about financial records. Anything you have that's confidential, consider the need to mask that data.
Okay, great. I think one of the key takeaways from this session today is that how relevant this is for any business that needs to comply with GDPR. So again, this is putting together another business case about data masking. How would you say that GDPR itself promotes data masking?
Right, well, GDPR is about protecting that personally identifiable information, and there are a number of articles within GDPR that ask you to take this sort of thing into consideration. We got Article 6, 4E. Now, that's going to be understandable to people doing GDPR. That's where there's a requirement to have safeguards in place, including encryption or pseudonymization. So you need to look at that sort of thing. Then there's another article, Article 25.1, and again that's about making sure you mask data to protect people's rights and the freedoms of the natural person when you're using their information. So that's again making sure that you can't link all the information you have about a person to an individual if there's no requirement to do so. Then we have Article 32A, and this is the responsibility of both the controller and the processor to implement appropriate technical organizational measures to ensure the level of security is appropriate to the risks they face. And again, linking that back to pseudonymization and encryption. And that's something I said earlier. As an organization, it's not about second guessing anybody. It's about you looking at your organization, understanding your information, and applying the right controls to mitigate the risks that you face. Then we have two other controls or articles around GDPR. There's Article 42 and then there's Article 89.1. And all of them are really about these safeguards around data minimization and pseudonymization. So it's always good if you're implementing this standard, these new controls in 27001, go back to GDPR, look at those article numbers, and just see that you're applying them in line with those article numbers. That way you kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah, there's so many different connections there, isn't there, between the GDPR articles and data masking control. Now that you've explained them all, Steve, you can see why it just definitely makes sense to include this control in 270. Gosh, get my teeth in 27002. And it's going to be key in the migration over to 27,001, the new standard, when that comes out.
And I heard last week that is now set for October this year. That was from somebody that is actually on the discussion panel. And when I think about it, that was the original date that was put forward anyway. And it all suddenly shot forward to June, but we've passed June. So October looks like the date.
Okay, fingers crossed that all goes through then. Okay, well, that's been a great overview on data masking, Steve. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or share with our listeners in relation to this particular aspect?
Yeah, as we've spoken through today, we've gone on about this being linked into GDPR, but that's one of the things, the messages coming out from this standard is that it can be linked into many other standards. We've got SAS 70, we've got Pci Dss, we've got NIST controls and that sort of thing. All the security control systems that are out there can now be linked in together. So if we're applying these controls for 27002, have a look at what the other standards are saying, especially if you're using them in your organization, and make sure everything is aligned. Don't start creating, oh, we do this for 27,000, but we do this for NIST. Or we do this for NIST and we do this for Cyber Essentials, because that will get you into a mess. You say, right, what do they all want? What is the sort of the base level we need to work to, and work to that? Because in some cases you'll exceed the requirement, in other cases you will just meet the requirement. So look very carefully at what you're doing, particularly if you've got lots of standards in place.
Yeah, great tip, Steve. Yeah, 100% on that. I think at the end of the day, if you have one system that's, becomes part of your organisation's DNA, regardless of the number of standards, because, we've got clients with, at least 7 ISO standards and other security controls and other standards, but it's one system, one way of working, and you're bringing all the requirements in. One isn't better than the other. It's all, all feeds into the one.
Yes, yeah.
Bespoke system, based on that client's risks and what they actually need as a business. It doesn't need to be overly complicated either, does it? Simpler the better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be appropriate to the organisation and its risk needs.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time today, Steve. Really appreciate that.
It's a pleasure.
We will be including all these notes in our podcast show notes, the ISO show, which is available over on www.blackmoresuk.com. And also for those that are interested in having some online resources, this topic plus many of the other new changes to ISO 27002 and the new 27001 will be in the Isology Hub. So that's www.isologyhub.com, which will be coming out over the coming months. Okay, so thanks once again for listening, and we look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.